Well, can obedience be dangerous? You may wonder what I mean by that, because we usually think of obedience as kind of a guardrail. It's a safeguard for us. You know, like when you tell little kids, don't touch that hot stove, right? It would actually be dangerous not to obey. But is there any instance in which it could be dangerous to obey? Well, I think there is, but there's actually a couple ways we can look at this. First, you know, if something like a negligent parent or a superior tells you to do something that's wrong or unsafe, well, that could be dangerous. You know, like if you tell a kid, go out in the street and get that as the cars are racing by. Or if you tell your employee, reach in there and fix that as the machine is running and it could easily take off a finger or a hand or an arm. If you obey a command like that, it's dangerous. But sometimes even obeying a good command can be dangerous. Not because it's wrong or because there's anything unsafe in and of itself in that command, but because other people may not like what you are doing when you obey. I remember one time telling the truth because I was always told to tell the truth. And when I did, all of my peers were upset at me because they were trying to deceive someone and get something that they didn't deserve. And this can be especially true when we obey God, because there are many people in our world who don't live by God's ways or hold to godly morals. And so if you obey God and people don't like it, it can be dangerous. Now, in our culture today, that mostly means something like you may be criticized or ostracized or mocked. You could be passed over for a promotion or for some kind of advancement. You could possibly be fired or mistreated in some other way. But there are people in many places in our world who are actually being killed for following Jesus. And it has started even here in America. And I'm not just talking about Charlie Kirk. It's happening probably more than you know, even here in America. But it doesn't usually get the big headline. But obeying God is always the right thing to do. But sometimes it can be dangerous. And that is what we see in our study in Daniel today. And we need to ask ourselves, are we willing to obey, even if it's dangerous, even in the face of death, or simply if it might negatively impact our lives in some way? So let's begin in Daniel chapter 3 and verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And so, first of all, last week we read that Nebuchadnezzar had taken some young men from Judah, from Israel, and had took them back to Babylon. And they were trained and indoctrinated into Babylonian thinking and the ways of Babylon. And so we read about Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. And they were found to be exceptional at what they did. And they were put into important positions. Well, so now we are coming to chapter 3. And at this point, the king has decided to build a giant statue. And when we read this, we might wonder if this statue building was inspired by the dream he had that we talked about last week. He had a dream of a giant statue, and the explanation was that he was the golden head of that statue. Now, it's not really what he should have taken away from that dream, but he is arrogant and he may have. But there's this plain as in flat land, outside of the city, and Nebuchadnezzar has this image built there. It's 90 feet tall, so about the size of a 10-story building, and 9 feet wide. And it's covered in gold, so it's gold-plated. And we're not given an exact description of this statue. We're not told what it looks like except for those measurements and that it's gold. It's often assumed that this statue was the figure of a man, or maybe specifically Nebuchadnezzar himself. If so, you would think it may have been either a disproportionate man, like very tall and slender man, or it could have been a regular shaped, proportionate man on top of a giant pillar or some kind of base, large base. On the other hand, one of the things that we know about this image is that it was to be worshiped as a god. And so here's something that could possibly be significant to this situation. Although in many ancient Near Eastern cultures, the kings were thought of as gods, this was not the case in Babylonian society. This was not the case in Babylon. And so this may not have looked like Nebuchadnezzar or a man at all. It may have been just a depiction of one of Babylon's gods, or something that represented several of their gods, because they had many. But it was dedicated here to the king. And so whatever the image was, it was built to honor the king and to test people's loyalty to him. Now, this is why the leaders came from every level of government and from all the places in all the parts of the Babylonian Empire. They all had to come to the statue's dedication. So let's keep reading, verse 3. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace." And so all of the officials are gathered there together in front of this statue, the image, for the dedication ceremony. And they are given these instructions. Really, it's a command. They are demanded that when the music plays, and then he names off all these different kinds of instruments. And so Nebuchadnezzar has a big band there, or maybe an orchestra there ready to play. But when they play, all of the leaders from all over the empire are to bow down and worship the image. Then the king threatens them with death if they don't do what they were just told, if they don't bow down and worship the image. So refusing to do this is seen as disloyalty, it's seen as treason against the throne, and the punishment is immediate death by burning. So the person would be thrown into a furnace. This furnace would most likely be one that was set up there to melt down the gold that was used to cover the image. And so it would burn at a high temperature. And it would also be located near that plane where the work was done, where the image is set up. And so this makes it a very convenient and immediate way to punish anyone who was disloyal. But not only that, not only would the empire be rid of any kind of disloyal leaders, but this would also act as a deterrent for others. It's right there. Go throw them in. So they would decide not to rebel against the king, because you know what happens when you rebel against the king. Verse 7. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So every leader that was there was expected to conform. And everything went just as they expected. The band played, and all the people assembled there bowed down and worshiped the image. At least as far as the king could tell. I mean, it was a big crowd. But we'll find out that he didn't notice 3 guys who remained standing when everyone else bowed. They refused to compromise their beliefs. Look at verse 8. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans or Babylonians came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." And so some of the native Babylonian wise men notice that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't bow to the image. And so they go to the king to report them. And so this word that's translated maliciously accused, that word literally means they ate or chewed the pieces of. So it's kind of like they went to chew them. But it's a word picture. It's figurative, a figure of speech for speaking against someone or slandering someone. And it has a negative, spiteful, attacking idea to it. And so the thing is, as they come to the king, they're not directly saying anything that isn't true, but they are implying that these Jewish men are disloyal to the king. They want to get these guys in trouble. They want to do them damage. And it appears that they don't like the fact that these foreigners have been put in a high position. Maybe they were given jobs that these guys wanted for themselves. Or maybe these native Babylonians don't like the idea that they have to answer to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But anyways, they resent these Jews who are in the king's service. And so they go tell the king. But the first thing they say is they remind him of what he just commanded everyone to do. Then they remind him about the punishment that he just declared that anyone who didn't do what he just commanded them to do would receive. And then they tell him that there are some Jews who he put in charge of things in Babylon who didn't obey. And so notice a couple things here. First, they again specifically state that these men are Jews. And secondly, they specifically say that they were appointed by the king to lead in Babylon. And so clearly they resent these Jewish men being in leadership. But they also seem to be implying that the king made a mistake in appointing them to these positions. At the very least, they're saying these men don't deserve the positions that you gave them. They're not loyal to you. And when they finally make the charge against them, it has three parts. First, they say that they pay no attention to the king. So they've ignored the king's command. They don't take him seriously, so they don't obey him. They're not loyal to the king. Secondly, they do not serve Babylon's gods. So they're not good Babylonians. They're outsiders who don't belong here. They don't fit in with Babylonian culture and values. And thirdly, they didn't bow down and worship the golden image that the king set up. They didn't do what they were told to do, even though everyone else did. They didn't actually tell the king here what he needs to do, that he needs to put them to death, but they're implying it. I mean, they've already just reminded him, this is what you said, so what are you going to do? Verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought in. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the hornpipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" And so the king is really mad. And he tells his people to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to him. And when they get there, he confronts them. It's kind of like, I was told that you didn't bow. Is this true? But then he doesn't even wait for them to give an answer. For some reason, he's giving them a second chance. Didn't he just say, whoever doesn't do this will immediately be cast in the furnace? But for some reason, he's giving them a second chance. Maybe he likes them. Or maybe he doesn't want to lose three of his best officials. But whatever the reason, he doesn't immediately kill them like he said he would. And he gives them a new opportunity, and they can respond differently. So he'll have the band play again, and they can bow and worship the image. And if they do, then they will be spared. But if they don't, then they will be immediately thrown into the fiery furnace. And then Nebuchadnezzar says something that sounds like a challenge to God. Now, the king, he's had some experience with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God. We saw that last week when Daniel told him what his dream was and then interpreted it. And he praised God for knowing all this. So Nebuchadnezzar, he knows that God knows all and that he is greater than other gods. But that doesn't mean he rightly understands everything about God. And he clearly doesn't recognize God's great power. And he doesn't think that he or any other God, so-called God, would be able to protect someone from being burnt to death in his fiery furnace. So if they refuse to obey, he is determined they will die. Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, Be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So before Nebuchadnezzar even has the chance to have the band play, to give them that opportunity to bow again, they say, it's not going to happen. They respond with complete confidence. I mean, they're respectful to the king, but they are also totally sure about God. And they first say that they don't need to answer the king in this matter. And it's like, we don't have to support him or back him up. We know what God's able to do. They're saying that they don't need to respond to the king's challenge to God. They simply say, if they were to be thrown into the furnace, God can deliver them. There's no question about whether or not he is able to do this, able to save them. He can. But they don't know if he will. You see, they have complete confidence in God, but at the same time they are humble and they will submit to God's will, whatever God wants to do, whatever his will is. See, God may choose to save them or he may not. God may have other plans. But that doesn't change what they will do. They will obey God, whether he saves their lives or not. They will not go against God in order to obey the king and worship Babylon's gods or his image, because they are fully committed to God and they are firmly resolved to remain faithful to him. Now think about this. If you remember back when we were studying Jeremiah, Jeremiah prophesied to the people in Judah. And he said that they would be in exile in Babylon for 70 years. And then we also read that he wrote letters to the exiles who were in Babylon. And he told them, settle down. Get a home, have your families, get married, do those things. Settle down there and be productive members of society. And he even told them to seek the good of the society or the city where God takes them, wherever God puts them. Okay, so now let's also think about this question. Why did God send Israel into exile in the first place? Because of their idolatry, right? To teach them not to worship other gods. They had been. So this was punishment for worshiping other gods and teaching them not to worship other gods. But now, these two ideas, the idea of go be a productive, good citizen of whatever town I send you to, and don't worship other gods, these two ideas are clashing here. At least they seem to be clashing. See, because in Babylon, the Babylonians are insisting that they worship their gods, the Babylonian gods, and that you have to in order to be a good member of society. If you're going to be a good Babylonian, you've got to worship our gods. So can they seek to be a good member of society and be faithful to God? Well, this brings us back to what we mentioned last week. The idea of being in the world, but not of the world. We are to live in this world, and we are to be productive members of society, and we are to seek the good of our society, and at the same time think of how we can benefit our society. But when our culture, our society clashes with God, with God's truth, with God's morality, with God's ways, we obey God. When our world tells us to think this way or live one way, but God tells us the opposite, we politely yet firmly refuse the way of the world and listen to God. But what will happen to us when we do this? We don't know. But we know it will please God and it will honor God. And God will do whatever is best. He will work through the situation in a way that will best fulfill his purposes. But let's read what happened with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we're reminded that God is in control. Verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. So Nebuchadnezzar doesn't like their answer. And now he's really, really mad at them. And his face shows it. And he has his people heat up the furnace 7 times more than normal. Now, the number 7 is often used as a symbolic number of completion or wholeness. And so what he's saying here is that they've turned the furnace all the way up. All right? It's as hot as they can get it. And he tells some of his strongest warriors to tie the 3 of them up, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego up, and to throw them in the furnace. I think about this, I'm like, why is he having them tie him up? I mean, if they were the strongest men, couldn't they just taken them and thrown them in the furnace? I thought maybe he wants to make sure they can't get away. I mean, he's sure that no God could save them from the furnace, but maybe he thinks that God might be able to save them on the way to the furnace. I don't know. But he ties them up before they get thrown into the furnace. And so this furnace, it would have an opening in the top of it where metals could be lowered down into the furnace and then taken back up after they were melted. And then there would also be an opening or a door on the side of the furnace through which they could put in wood or fuel, and they could also stoke the flames. And you would be able to see through that doorway as well. But the furnace was likely dug into the side of a hill where people could just walk up the hill to the opening to throw things in or put things in. And then, like I said, you could see into the furnace through the opening on the side. And notice that we're given these details about what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are wearing. And names off several articles of clothing. In other words, they are fully clothed with a lot of clothes on when they're tied up and thrown into the fire. These details are to set up the scene and set up what will happen and what won't happen in a minute. You see, all of that fabric would easily catch fire and burn quickly. And that's what you would expect. You would expect that as soon as they got towards the fire or got into the fire, that all those clothes are just going to go up in flames and they will immediately burn. But let's keep reading verse 22. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like the son of a son of the gods." And so there was such a rush to put them to death that these warriors didn't have time to protect themselves from the heat of the furnace. And so, because it's really hot. And so when they get close enough to throw the guys into the furnace, the heat from the furnace kills them. Now catch that. It was so hot that they were outside of the furnace and the heat overwhelmed them and they died. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell into the furnace and they're totally fine. And the king can't believe what he's seeing. You see, they expected that their clothes would immediately catch fire, that these men would crumple, their bodies would crumple, and they would just burn to ash. But that doesn't happen. In fact, they're just hanging out in the middle of the fire. And they're not tied up anymore. So apparently the rope's burnt, but nothing else. And then the king notices a fourth man in the fire. And so he turns to his officials and he confirms that they only threw in 3, right? Yeah. So not only are there now 4 men, but the fourth man looks like, he says, a son of the gods. So he looks supernatural or divine. And later in verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar will call him the angel or messenger of God. But this description here fits with Nebuchadnezzar's worldview. You see, he believes in many gods. And the fourth man looks like a god. But the thing that is clear here is that in spite of the king's earlier confident statement that no god would deliver them or could deliver them, God has delivered them. Look at verse 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God. He knows who their God is. Come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their head was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. So it looks like the king loses his presence of mind here for a second, and he runs up towards that burning furnace that just killed the other 2 men who threw him in. And he doesn't think about it. He has servants who could run up to the window. No, he just runs up there and he says, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, come out here. And so he calls them out. So not only could that be dangerous to him, but he just does it anyways. He could have just said someone else, go do it, but he just does it. And the 3 men come out, and all of the officials with the king, they're looking at them, and they're inspecting them. Apparently they're smelling them too. But they're inspecting them, and they're like, there's no evidence at all that they were even in the fire. I mean, nothing's burnt, nothing is singed at all. And in fact, they can't even smell any smoke on them. So not only were their lives saved, they were completely protected from the fire. It had 0 effect on them. Verse 28. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own. Therefore, I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. And so Nebuchadnezzar, he recognizes the power and the greatness of God. And he praises God because he delivered his servants. But Nebuchadnezzar also praises Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego for trusting God. So even though it meant disobeying the king's command, He respects them for trusting their God. You see, they trusted God and did what was right before God, even though they knew they would be thrown into the furnace. They refused to worship any other God than their own God, than the one true God. Nebuchadnezzar didn't like their disobedience, but he respects their faithfulness to God. And he respects God's power. He's just seen a miracle, and it has deeply affected him. And he makes a new decree. So what he's saying now, he's setting it in law. That anyone who speaks critically or negatively or unfavorably about Israel's God was to be put to death. Before, it was anyone who doesn't bow down to my image, my gods that I've set up, will be put to death. Now it's anyone who talks bad about the true God will be put to death. And the reason he gives for this is that no other God is able to save his people like this. In other words, he is a powerful God. But along with that, although it's not stated, Nebuchadnezzar is probably scared. He's probably attempting to appease this great God who he had just wrongly challenged. What God is there who could save you? He knows he shouldn't have said that. And it looks like he's trying to get on God's good side. And then he promotes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Of course, this is probably also self-serving because he wants people who serve this great God, this powerful God, to be working for him and to be working for his kingdom. And so if God supports his people and he makes their work successful, then it will benefit Babylon. It will benefit the king. But all in all, what we see here, again, is that God is in control. Not the king, not anyone else. God is in control. So, does this mean that if we are faithful and obey God, everything will always go well for us? If I find myself in a sticky situation and I do what's right, can I be certain that nothing bad will happen to me? No. Just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we don't know. We don't know what God will choose to do. We don't know his plan. We don't know how he will choose to work in and through our lives, even through our deaths. But we know what's right. The question is, will we do it? I want to talk just quickly about a couple of illustrations from the New Testament. Peter and John were telling people about Jesus, and the church was growing. But the unbelieving Jews, the Jewish leaders, didn't like it. And they arrested the people who didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. They didn't like it, and so they arrest Peter and John, and they told them to stop telling people about Jesus. And Peter and John boldly stood their ground, and they told those leaders about Jesus. I find that hilarious. Stop talking about Jesus. Okay, let me tell you about Jesus. That's what they did. They said, this is Jesus. We're talking because of Jesus. And they went on to talk about Jesus. And they said that there is no other way of salvation. And the Jewish leaders again demanded that they stop talking about Jesus, and they threatened them. And this was their response. You can find it in Acts chapter 4, verses 19 and 20. But they said, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than God, you must judge. For we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. In other words, they're saying, Do whatever you want to do, but we're not going to stop. We're going to do what's right. We're going to obey God. And they kept on obeying God, and God protected them from those Jewish leaders. Well, then you move just a few chapters more forward in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 6 and 7, and we see Stephen. God was allowing Stephen to do miracles, and he was helping people, and he was teaching, but some people didn't like his faith in Jesus. They didn't like his teaching, what he was telling them about Jesus. And so they went and they accused Stephen of saying things that he didn't say, and they had him arrested, and he was taken before the Jewish leaders. Long story short, in his defense, Stephen spoke the truth again, and he exalted Jesus. And then they killed him for it. And as he was dying, he followed Jesus' example and asked God not to hold this sin against them. Stephen did everything right. He was faithful and he obeyed, but he was killed for it. Peter and John, they lived. Stephen, he died. God is able to save. God is in control, but we don't know what he will choose to do. And so we do what's right, and we trust him to do what's best, whatever that is. So if my struggle can bring more people to Jesus than my ease, and that's what God wants, then so be it. That's his choice. My part is just to be faithful. Whether God may be more glorified by my life or by my death, that's his choice. My part is to be faithful, to obey, to live for him as long as I have breath. So, can obedience be dangerous? Yes, it can. I mean, you may be resented or mocked or hated. On the other hand, you may be respected. You could lose a job or get passed over for a promotion, or God may bless you. You could lose friends or even lose your life. Or God may protect you from those things. But God is in control. And in the end, standing with God is the most secure place you can be. Will you stand while everyone else bows?